That's great. And Gary, I'll ask you, but it's interesting. I've heard from a lot of end user customers saying pretty much the same thing, that we flipped the switch, or we did it over a weekend, or we did it overnight, and suddenly we had everybody on. And what we've done is we've changed change control for the IT industry. We used to do proof of concept, and then phase 1 and phase 2 and phase 3, and you'd have a 4-month rollout. And what we discovered as an industry was that if you flip everybody over overnight, you don't have any more complaints than you do if you take it out over 3 or 4 months. So that's one of the major changes that the industry is learning. Gary, what were your experiences back in the early days when you had to send everybody home?
Yeah, our experiences were actually similar to Jocelyn's. In late 2019, we had enabled everyone with Microsoft 365. So we as collaboration professionals always said, any place, anytime, any device, it works. No one believed us. We have to be in an office. But in March of 2020, and let me just go back a little bit. Prior to that, around 2015, we had enabled every conference room with video conferencing. So we were a video-first organization. Every meeting from 2016-ish on was a video meeting. And it was a fairly easy transition moving home. It was just the timing, very, very similar, right? I mean, to all of us, really. I mean, March works at home, and 24 hours later, it's going to be 1 week. We got into that week. It's same 2 weeks, 4 weeks, a month. Now I'm also on a committee that's return to office committee that used to meet weekly, and now we meet monthly, and cancel most of those meetings because we're not going to return to the office like we used to. That's just not realistic anymore. I mean, the office is now. I mean, I say this to people. We have 500 employees. We have 500 conference rooms now. That's the way we look at it. So we have same problems, right, that we all have with the end user at home with the internet and those problems. So we're trying to find ways to monitor that. So when they're blaming the application, or I have a problem with Teams or Zoom or BlueJeans or whatever the case may be, we can analyze those things. We look at those things. They're very important to say, no, have you rebooted your computer? Have you done this? Trying to be proactive with some of those support things. It's not easy. Another interesting thing, I didn't realize it yesterday, but we talked about it yesterday in a meeting, because we're building an office space now in Princeton, New Jersey, about 20,000 square feet, that we're calling the Collaboration Center of Excellence. It's going to be rooms and space that people can come into. There's only one assigned spot, and that's for the CEO. The rest of it is a half a dozen flex offices that other executives can use, but they're also going to be part-time conference rooms that people can use. There's going to be open space like this, like we're in, that maybe we're going to roll in collaboration boards, all-in-ones, those kind of things. But we look at the technology. I remember one of the earliest complaints back then was, when we were big Teams people then, was I only see 4 people on the screen. With Zoom or with BlueJeans or whatever, I could see 9 or 25 or whatever. Look how fast forward now. Look at where we are now. Everybody has 49 people or whatever the number is now, and you could page through people, and so now the experience to me is much better remotely than it is in the conference room. Imagine if we had brought in this space, people remotely. We can build spaces for this, which is wonderful. We can build spaces that are 100% remote, which is wonderful. But meeting in the middle there, that's the big challenge. The holy grail is everyone experiences the same thing. Hopefully we get there someday, but I think we're hovering in that middle line in between in the two, and which is most important, for those things. And that's, I mean, I could go on and on here, but I do want to mention, personas. It's something that, you have to sort of understand, and we've done a better job of this at building our new space now, of understanding the personas of the people who we're going to meet. We used to, as IT, decide, hey, this is what the room's going to be. Somebody would make that decision, and then people would use it as it was. Now, I think we're doing a better job of getting feedback from end users, from the CEO to the executive assistants to the commercial team. So we're meeting with them, and how are you going to use this space? What are you going to do? What would you like us to do? So we're using that input and some of our own, expertise to guide the decisions that we make in those spaces.
So I definitely want to get back to the topics that both of you raised, Jocelyn and Gary, about hybrid working and what's going on and how you're designing rooms going forward. I want to stop with and just go with David just for a second, because I want to get your perspective on what those early days were like. The flock to the poly headsets and how much demand there was for them. What's going on with some of our video systems? Why don't you give us a little perspective about what you went through?
Yeah. So I mean, first of all, if you look at just what we did at Poly. Obviously, we were relatively well prepared. We were fairly lucky in that if you build the hardware, you have lots of things to give to folks. But there were still the cultural things that you mentioned, right? We were probably more than almost any company, a video first, a remote first kind of an organization. But there's still a lot of changes just in the way that people did work. We realized, a lot of the things that maybe were done casually, that weren't in structured meetings. So I think a lot of the things you raised, no matter how prepared you were technically, and we probably couldn't have been more prepared, still came in. And I'm sure we'll get to some of that in the panel later. But it was interesting from the company's perspective, looking at what was going on with our customers. First, on the audio side, you had mentioned, for example, people started using their Apple AirPod things. People were, just grabbing whatever they might have. And it was very quickly evident to us, just from the demand that we were seeing, from what we were hearing from the customers, that audio was kind of the baseline, right? And maybe because a lot of people still had video turned off. So just helping people be heard, particularly, you could find that the people who had better audio were able to kind of interject in a meeting. They got heard, they were picked up. Those that were a little bit behind, maybe not so much. So we saw a lot of demand on the audio side first, whether that was headsets, the small portable speaker devices, things like that. A bit later on, I think people then were worried about, hey, now we're going back to video, we're going to turn that on. And how do we get maybe not the same experience, but a comparable experience to what we were used to when we were in meeting facilities, when we were actually out there. So we were suddenly looking at how do we improve the video as well, and I think the demand kind of followed for that as well.
Yeah, we released the P-Series. Was that something that we did in response to the pandemic, or had that been on the drawing board?
Probably the best way to phrase it would be we accelerated it a little bit. That was something that I definitely can say we were looking at. We knew that was a market that really needed to be addressed. When it was 2 weeks, maybe we'd have probably stayed on the original timeline. But it became clear very quickly that people were going to be working from home. They wanted that same level of experience that they were getting and quality that they were getting out of a meeting room, out of personal devices. So we accelerated that. We brought it up a little bit to be able to get those more quickly to market, just based on what the demand was. But it was something that even before, I think we were seeing a trend of more people wanting to commute remotely, more people wanting to have this kind of hybrid environment.
Exactly, and let's actually talk about that. We, we're 2.5, maybe 3 years, depending upon how you gauge the start of this, into this, and the culture has definitely irrevocably changed. I think we can all agree to that. I don't know if the whole world agrees to that, but in this room, we kind of know what's going on. Some of the research studies that Poly initiated show something like 66% of the employees are not going to go back to an office full time. They're craving hybrid. Jocelyn, you did some studies at your company, right, where it's even a higher number. Can you just tell us about what people's impressions are of where we are with hybrid today?
Yeah, so we actually asked every employee to indicate in our HR tool their intention to return to an office. And it was around 76% of employee base said that they would not return even once a week. So, and it was very, 2% said 5 days. And, we're seeing that with the badge and data. So we've been encouraging employees to come back since the start of April, and it has been very slow. And I think what's also interesting was in the beginning of the pandemic, we started to hear a lot of things like, well, we're missing the water cooler moments and we need collaboration. And that talk track changed because our leaders and employees realized we have that virtually. We can do that at home without a problem. Whether it's a quick IM or it's just picking up the phone or it's, whatever it is, spending the first minute of the meeting talking about the weekend, you reinvented that and you learned to get you didn't miss it anymore. And so I think what we're starting to hear now is the pendulum is swinging back to where now we're hearing, and I'm hearing, well, we don't have the water cooler moments if people are home, but you didn't have those with a large percentage of your employee base prior to the pandemic because they were all remote or traveling, right? Not necessarily in an office every day. So I think that the next step in terms of cultural transformation is to reassure that it's okay that you're not gathered around physically face to face, because we do have the technology, and continue to reiterate that we have the technology to enable that type of experience, that whether it's subliminally people are actually missing it or it's made up, right? Because we need some excuse to get people excited to come in. We've tried everything from free lunch to free coffee to, we'll give you the afternoon off, come in and we'll hang out. And that's not what is important to employees anymore. And so we need to make sure that we're listening to them and that we're taking that seriously, because I see companies that do that, companies that continue to lean into the technology that they're giving their employee base are going to far succeed over the companies that want to bring everybody back into the office from 9 to 5 days a week.
Gary, what's the culture in your organization? Same thing, different?
Yeah, so you're saying that if we get a barista in once a week, it's not going to bring people in? All right, so much for that idea I had. So yeah, it's really no different, to be honest with you. I have a story from last week. We had an international meeting where about 70 colleagues internationally came to our office in the UK, and a colleague of mine from IT said, I was actually in the office for 4 days because our CEO was there, and 60 or 70 people from around the globe came in, for meetings that week. And he said, I got nothing done on my to-do list, but I did get about 25 more things added to my to-do list by talking to people. So I think for us, everybody, same thing. We statistically, more people want to work remotely than want to come into the office. But culturally, I think one thing that may change for us is our CEO, when we build our space in Princeton, is likely to be in that office 3 to 4 days a week. That's, from talking to him, that's what his intention is. I have a feeling just culturally, people are going to trend more towards being in the office because the CEO is there. But the fact is, we have to create spaces that are purpose-driven spaces. We have to make sure that what we're building there, and when people do come in for a purpose, that they're able to do the things that they do and need to do with the technology that we provide for them.
I think we have a question here. So they can see you, Craig. Give you your name and where you're from.
Craig Derr with Wayne House Research. So I'm really interested when you talked about doing some polling of your employees. And so there's this elusive idea also out there that people are trying to gather around productivity, difficult to measure. And so there's a pendulum, especially what you're saying about the poll. You ask people what they want to do, they stay home. But somewhere, are you able, or have you thought about measuring the balance between productivity and well-being? So the output of the people and their happiness that encourages them to continue to provide output. I don't think anyone solved for that. I'm just curious if you guys have wrapped your brain around this as well.
It actually is something that we're doing now. We're working with a vendor partner on looking at analytics to figure out what it's the data that we have and how do we interpret that to mean an equal productivity versus wellness. And so I don't have a good answer to tell you other than I get asked all the time. And so we've started to provide some productivity metrics that are out of our Microsoft environment, right? In terms of what percentage of employee base is using video. We have that number, right? But does video necessarily equal productivity? It may equal engagement. So we're still working through that. We're definitely it is something that we put a lot of pressure on. And I think it's because we're trying to answer that question. Are employees more productive at home or more productive in the office, or what does the hybrid work? I mean, we have a lot of personal stories about where things work or don't work. I mean, I know that when I'm physically in my car driving in to my office, I could be at home taking a call, and actually I could take a call from my car, but I can't see the person, I can't see the content, I'm just listening. And it is a different experience than being immersed in all of that. So anecdotally, we have people's perceptions, but we are surveying employees about their sentiment, not just their sentiment about being in an office or being hybrid or being full-time home, but also the technology and sort of as like a technology baseline assessment of where do we go next?
I'll make a quick comment on the productivity thing. I think it really, I mean, if you have I'm sounding a little philosophical on it. If you have goals, you ultimately our role is about, what are your goals, right? So we do OKRs, objectives, key results, as our process for that. So if we're meeting those goals, whether we're in an office or whether at home, kind of what's the difference where we are, right? I mean, so, and if our leaders have written those goals correctly and they cascade down, then we're just supposed to do the job no matter where it is, So as far as the wellness goes, I actually do have a personal story on that. As I mentioned, we research treatments and cures for rare diseases. We also hire employees with rare diseases. Prior to the pandemic, the unemployment rate was ridiculously high for people with disabilities. And one of the reasons was there's a technology gap. You had to come into the office to be a participant, right? But with technology, you don't have to be in the office. You can contribute from anywhere. So it enables people living with disabilities to now be productive people, both perceptively too, because people thought like, oh wow, they have a disability, they can't come in. Well, one thing that we did early on with the people here at Poly is we have a gentleman by the name Anthony DiVirgilio living with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. He's living his life in a wheelchair on a ventilator. Anthony would come to the office one day a week, but he obviously, and even in the winter, he couldn't come. So reached out to the Poly team, and I said, what can we do? Can we get him something? And one of his concerns was the ventilator noise on his on his ventilator on his wheelchair, and he would be very hesitant to join meetings because of the ventilator noise. He would always be mute. He would always have his video shut off. He didn't want to see him. He didn't want people seeing him. So he felt self-conscious about it. Well, we got him the device and the
Poly P15,
which is the one I have too. And it had noise canceling in it. And this was before it was on the application side. Poly had it on the device side, so we had noise cancellation. And Anthony started to use this, and you couldn't hear the ventilator noise anymore from our side of the meeting. And Anthony, in his own words, basically said, "This camera changed my life. I was now able to participate in meetings, not needing to hit mute all the time, not being reluctant to contribute into meetings." So this is an N of one. We've changed one life, but we've changed one life, and I think, the way I look at technology is how do we continue to do that? And how do we, in this case, we created a very nice wellness story to your question on wellness. Don't know if we're doing it across the board for everybody else, but I know we did it for Anthony.
So quick housekeeping note, if anyone is interested in hearing that in Anthony's own words, we will give you the link to the blog we have, and we have some video of him on YouTube so you can hear it in his own words. It's a great story. I used to do a question, just one more quick thing, David. They've been talking about meeting equity or meeting equality, and there's actually a difference. Craig, thank you very much for your slide last week. Obviously, none of us are there yet.
Right.
The people sitting in a conference room are not having the same experience as the people sitting at home, both because there are things you can do in one room that you can't do in the other, and because of the the shots and the experience. But we're approaching the solutions.
Yep.
Can you kind of give us a little bit of words from the poly perspective?
Yeah,
So we're getting closer to that.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that I think are worth looking at in that context. So one is that you can look at it on kind of a couple of axes, right? There is making sure that the experience in terms of audio, in terms of video, in terms of that sort of quality is the same. And that's going to play in the second piece in my thought is sort of the experience and the way that it feels to you, right? And how you're able to interact. But if you don't have that level playing surface of equal video, equal audio, it's very hard to get the experiential side correct, right? Because what we're really looking toward at that goal, and you mentioned giving people who are remote the same experience as the room, but frankly, you've got an almost flipped version of that problem these days as well. We have more people in many meetings who are remote than we actually have in the room. And so, for many years, we were looking at a meeting where 90% of the people were in the large room or, all but one or two. And we were very focused on making that great experience for the 1, 2, 3 remote participants. Now, you've also got to be looking at how do we get that equality of experience for the 3 people that went into the office one day every month and the 50 who are participating remotely, right? Whether that's in terms of, just being right in front of your own device, being able to control things and quickly get on. So I think we're looking at both a technology piece of that, where if you are at home and you probably don't have the high-end equipment that you've got in the office, how do we give you that same audio video experience? But also, how do we make sure that regardless of, hey, this is my 1 day a week to go in, or it's my 4 days a week that I'm at home, that experience, that the interaction that you have feels the same, right? And so I think there's kind of 2 different axes we've got to look at that on.
And I'm clearly the old guy in the room, and we shouldn't have a party because of COVID, because of how horrific it was. But we have to look at the progress that's been made in our industry and just stop for a second and take a look at it. When I would walk into a conference room, you first have to find the remote control and hope it has batteries, or find the touch panel and decipher what's in it and get your shot, and you have the mechanical cameras moving around. We've taken that experience completely away, right? It's now you walk into the room and all the devices are smart enough to know what they need to do.
Yep. And home amplified that, right? Because your laptop or your iPad or your phone was always yours, and the experience was just immediately that one that you wanted there, right? I've said before, for many years, most of us have been very involved in the video industry. We've been trying to convince everybody that video is ready and video is the right thing. We got our wish, right? Everybody uses video now. And so now it's the sort of now what? We really do have to deliver on all of that excellent experience we've been promising for many years.
And when we go upstairs later, you can take a look, if you haven't seen, how some of the AI and machine learning work in our systems to really see this. Do you have a question, sir?
Yeah.
Again, your name and where you're from, so people can't see you.
Avi Greengart from Texponential. So actually, you started asking my question, just didn't follow through.
Keep me honest.
Jocelyn, you said that some ridiculous percentage of your folks don't want to come in at all. And I kind of understand that, because when you're all working from home and everyone is remote, it's very clear how the systems work. It's clear who speaks next. It's clear how you follow an agenda. It's clear when you're mute and when you're not on mute. It's the hybrid question, and right behind you it says hybrid innovation. And I know that Polly's going to tell us all about their innovation part, but I wanted to know from the customer perspective, have you found any techniques that actually work to enable 3 people in a conference room and 7 people remote and actually have a productive meeting? Because it doesn't work in the educational context at all.
Yeah, no, I know exactly what you're saying. And have an example. Just last week, I was in the office, and there were 6 of us physically in a room and 8 people or so online. And someone brought their laptop in and the meeting connected right away. So everyone was on the phone, could see us and hear us. And it took like 3 minutes for the person to start sharing her screen. And, I just was sitting next to her like, this is such an awful experience for the folks on the phone, I'm sure, but it was painful to be in the room. And then, we all have tried to institute a best practice where if you're physically in the room, you're also putting your camera on and muting audio. So you're not joining audio, but you are turning your laptop camera on so that people don't see, the side of your face. Even with the panning technology, when we're all sitting at a rectangular table, that's bound to happen. So we've tried to institute that. And what was interesting was a lot of us did have our cameras on, and I almost felt a little distracted that I could see myself on this giant screen, and so it was funny because I was so sensitive to all these different things. But some of the things that can help equal out the experience, and this also goes back to your question about wellness. So start meetings 5 minutes late. Always start them 5 minutes into the meeting. Schedule them that way. So 1:05 p.m., not 1:00 p.m., 1:05. It lets people that are transitioning from one room to another or from one building to another get there and have a little time. It also allows your remote folks to get up, stretch their legs, get some water, whatever, go to the kitchen. Spent a lot of time in the kitchen when I'm home.
And I'm glad you said 5 minutes late.
Yes.
Because so many people do it the other way, and it's human nature. You go over, it never works,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, and stick to that. And then even in the body of the email, I'll write this meeting starts at 1:05 p.m. Enjoy 5 minutes of stretching, whatever. So that's one thing. And then it's not related to Poly specifically, but certainly the Zooms and the Teams, and they all have features that you can leverage at your companies, such as raising the hand, assigning somebody to monitor that. I love that in Microsoft Teams, raise your hand, and also it also gives you the number of who rose their hand first, and it orders it so that you know who to call on. And so I think we do have a long way to go before it's 100% equal. On the flip side too, if I'm driving into the office and I go into a conference room and the camera's on in the conference room, and so the 3 or 4 people in the room are all on camera, and then the people at home aren't, it's not an equal experience for me, right? I'm in the room and I can't see you at home. So I think it's just continuing to leverage the features that we already have, and enforce them, and make sure that people feel comfortable as, this is status quo, turn your video on.
I don't have a ton to add to that, frankly, but I do think the one thing Jocelyn mentioned that's kind of an interesting intermediate step until the technology does get there is having everyone, if you're at the boardroom, like a room over there, you have everyone with their laptops open. We were even toying with the idea of putting iPads in an executive boardroom, putting iPads at each location, with pre-shutting off the speakers and mics, but there's just too many complications with that it really wouldn't work. It would limit the room, for other purposes and things like that. But having people come in, turn your laptop, open your laptop. The one thing that we've noticed on that is generally if you're in a bigger meeting with an executive and he or she is sitting on the end of the meeting, we're worried about the camera in the middle seeing the side of everybody because on a rectangular table. Now with the thing in front of you, you're looking at an executive over there, and your view is again the side of your face, because you're looking over at the executive doing a lot of the talking. But for now, I think that's it. The spaces that we're looking at building in Princeton and some of the rooms, we are looking at cameras on the side, at different locations to, but the technology the AI isn't quite there yet. But we're future-proofing those rooms by building the infrastructure to accommodate those cameras when they do get there. Because we had a meeting about it yesterday, and one of the chiefs said, well, if it's not yet going to be a great experience, what are we going to do in the meantime? Because we don't want to put it in if it's halfway. So we're toying with timing. Supply chain will have something to do with that too. But so that's all I have for that.
So David, we'll go into a couple of questions in the house as well. I wanted to ask you, don't tell us anything you can't, okay? Because we know what's NDA and we know future. But, looking at the future roadmap around this meeting equity, meeting equality, we kind of know what we're shooting for. We're shooting for a camera array in a room, the same as we have a microphone array, and smart and talking to each other. Can you give us like a few words on what that looks like?
Without getting into too much, one thing I will say is that the rooms are going to be used very differently than they were before the pandemic, right? And I think the key to that was, you mentioned almost nobody wants to come back in, right? When you come back in, you're not just going to come back in for, let's say, me to stand up at the front and, expound on something. You might as well do it from home, right? And you're not going to come in for just sitting at your desk and doing email. When people come in, they really are going to want to be collaborative in the way that they work, right? So to your point, it's not just going to be, one thing front of the room. You're going to have rooms that are going to be rearranged. You're going to have rooms where the people inside are engaging with each other, perhaps more than they did in the past, where often the reason we took that call was to talk to the far side. So without getting into the details of sort of where we're going with it, I'll say we've really recognized that those rooms have changed. And frankly, we rely on a lot of you to hear how they're changing. But, we recognize that it's the kind of camera in the front, everybody's looking there. It's going to be a very small sliver of the way people are actually using those rooms and using those spaces. We need to be much more flexible about it.
Thank you, David. All right, we have 4 more questions from the audience. So again, your name and where you're from.
Hi, I'm David Maldo with Let's Do Video. My question is, at the beginning of the session, we heard 3 themes that I'm hearing from companies all over the world. Is that better? Okay. The first theme is that people really like working from home. I mean, the majority, or at least plurality, are saying 1 day a week or no days a week, and very, very few are saying 5 days a week. So everyone wants to work from home. The second theme is that productivity doesn't seem to be an issue. I'm not hearing from anywhere. I haven't heard a single story from a CEO saying, I sent everyone home and no one did any work in the company life. And in fact, in some cases, I'm hearing the opposite. I'm hearing my team's working better at home. They're doing more work. And we're just starting to get metrics, just starting to measure it, but it doesn't seem to be a concern. So theme 1, everyone likes working at home. Theme 2, the work's getting done. And theme 3 is companies are bending over backwards to get people to come back into the office. We're sorry, I'm bad with the microphone. We're free lunch, afternoons off. Let's bring in a barista. Let's bring in a ping pong table. Let's see. All these
Which works for a week, right? Yeah.
Why are we doing that? Why are we so desperate to get people back in the office if they're happy at home and they're working better at home? And we even have our water cooler moments at home. I don't see any advantage, but every company is like, we got to get people back. What can we do? And I want to say, why is the boss saying that? Why is the boss approving these free lunches and all this other stuff? What's the urgency?
I'm gonna let you answer that, because I don't know the answer to that, right? You're exactly right. I mean, the answer to that question. None of us really know why we need to be in the office. I think in our case we're a small company. So we're building this space to allow people to come in for a purpose. And there are purposes. Now, I mean, we do scientific research, so our lab's never closed. So I didn't bring that up, probably should have, but we have, 60 or 70 scientists who work at lab benches in Philadelphia, because we do research with Penn Medicine and others, and they never left. You can't remotely work a microscope, not yet. At least I don't think you can. But yeah, it's really coming in for a reason. Maybe it is better that you sit around quarterly for a budget meeting or a strategy session or something like that. I do think there is value in that. I think those meetings. I think what we're looking at as an IT department is to have those meetings maybe quarterly, where we spend a whole day together. And that's the time we come in for a specific purpose with a more detailed agenda. There are things, let's face it, there are things that do work better when you're in person. I mentioned our colleague in the UK, he had 20 more things on his to-do list, that were valid things, because there were things that people won't bring up. They won't put a ticket in, but it's an idea that they may have. And I think sometimes in our case, and moving more into the innovation space at our company to come up with more little additional ideas. I think it's hard sometimes. I want to say it's hard. I think it's easier if we're together, brainstorming. I think those kind of sessions work better. Just my opinion. To answer your specific question about the Chiefs and their thoughts on that, maybe Jocelyn has a better answer, but you're going to have to ask them.
Yeah, Jocelyn, do you have any answers as to why the bosses want us all back in the same building?
I will speak generally when I answer this question. I think it's a lot of narcissism, honestly. I think that people want to be seen. I think that they want to be seen by their workforce. I think that there's some old school comfort to that. But I think it's a great question. And I think that, I think that more employees need to be courageous to ask that type of question of the leaders and folks that are driving some of that decisioning, because it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense no matter who you ask. I have my own sort of thoughts on perhaps all of the CEOs of this particular city got together and said, we're all going to mandate 2 days or 3 days in office because then we can help boost the economy. We are being promised by, the county that will get some tax benefits to doing that. All speculation, right? But I also shake my head and I'm just like, it doesn't make sense. We are not a small company. We have over 100 offices in the US and some international presence. And when I think about the real estate costs to keeping some of these offices open, to have a handful of people going into them, that may not even really want to be there. It could be reluctant, that they could be reluctant to even go in. It just baffles me too. And I thank you for the courageous question. I wish I were brave enough to go to my CEO and ask that question. But those are just my
So
thoughts.
there are 3 more questions in the audience, but David, I'll ask you to comment as well because
It's in the survey. That's the thing.
it is in the survey, but you and I are meeting today in the office with, my supervisor, with our CEO, with our people here. This place is built for us to have this meeting because we need it.
Yep.
I'm a 45-minute train ride away from here, right down there at Penn Station. I don't come here. I don't need to come here other than to facilitate these kinds of meetings. And we're as close to each other as we would be if we weren't working in an office. So I guess the answer is the technology works.
Yeah, no, I think that's there's kind of 2 comments. One, I think you're right. And I think that points out, again, there's got to be a reason that you want to come in. But I mean, the survey kind of dovetailing on that showed, I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was something like 70% of the folks didn't want to come back, but 70% of the leadership did want them to. So, what you saw is clearly really happening. Why is another question. But obviously the employees feel like they're getting what they want and, are having a good experience. But it is interesting that what you saw really is kind of borne out in the survey.
Hi, Blair Pleasant, Confusion and BC Strategies. So one of the areas that I focus on is end user adoption and training. And there's been some debate about, it was clearly important before the pandemic, but with the pandemic, and sending people home, you were like, this is the technology you're going to use. So end user training and adoption wasn't quite as important because you basically said, this is what you have to use. So did you change your strategies or programs for end user training and adoption, and how important is it these days?
Yeah, we actually definitely changed our strategy. And this year, one of our goals in 2022 is to further enhance the end user experience by asking them, what works for you, what doesn't work for you. What we saw with some conference rooms, as an example, is we uplifted all these conference rooms with video, and then people aren't using them at all. They're not even turning, we're just not turning video on. They're not even going into the room. They're in the office, but they're not going to a room. So we ask them, why aren't you using the room? Oh, well, we prefer to sit, at our desks, or we prefer to sit in the cafeteria and have a coffee. We don't really want to be in that room. And it was like, well, why didn't we ask them that ahead of time? Kind of going back to your personas. I think those are definitely evolving. The personas place, it's not a one and done. something that we have to relook at, and we are relooking at that. We do have a dedicated team as part of my organization that is all about driving user adoption and training of the technologies that we invested heavily in, because we can give everybody, an uplifted headset and camera and et cetera. And if they're not using it, or they're not using it to its potential, that investment was not realized, right, to its fullest. And that's what I want. I want to realize the investments that we've already made before we continue to make further investments that may or may not be right. So we've definitely, we have a whole team now that's dedicated to end user experience, really going out and meeting with our different business lines to say, okay, this particular business line does it this way, and this one really doesn't. Well, they don't do it that way because they're actuaries, or they're heads down all day on the keyboard, hands on keyboard, and this team is talking to our customers. So very different. So we are definitely doing a lot more in that space. I'm sure you are too.
Okay, we got 3 more questions in the audience. If you want a quick comment, go ahead. Let me go through them.
Go ahead. Well, I will make one quick comment. When in March of 2020, we immediately scheduled, we were using Blue Jeans at the time, but we immediately scheduled global Blue Jeans and Microsoft Teams training for the entire company, and continue those trainings, and that support and the quick reference guides and those things, continually make them available. And this technology changes so quickly. We are doing quarterly trainings as well, and we make stuff available real time too. So you're right, you have to focus on that. Certainly not forget it. Yeah.
Okay, well, keep going here. So I'm John Arnold, J. Arnold and Associates, also wearing the BC Strategies hat. Blair, you're starting a good conversation here, and I'm just going to say this: it's a moving target, right? I mean, I'm glad you guys have all this persona research, because there's too much nuance to say, oh, we're going to stay in office or not. And my experience too has been that people are so conditioned to working from home behind their screens all day. They come into the office, they still stay behind their screens. It's a learned behavior, right? I mean, it can be unlearned too, and this is going to be back and forth all the time. So I just want to ask, though, to the extent using Lens, right, tracking the metrics of all the endpoint usage, are you getting any kind of interesting learnings or maybe surprises about the extent these features and endpoints are being used, as well as adopted, right? I mean, you're buying them, you expect people to use them, but you're probably learning some interesting things from those metrics.
Well, I'll leave this to you, because we don't use Lens.
Okay. So we're using it minimally. We actually do not have it on some of our smaller rooms at this time, but we're continuing to monitor the data. And I know we've said this before to Polly, but I think it would be in their best interest to give us more data, right, so that they can have that too. But not using it to make any conclusions yet.
Rupam Jain from Frost & Sullivan. I think, Jocelyn, you mentioned both Teams and Zoom. At some point, I'm assuming if the employees are using both meeting platforms, and this is something that we saw during COVID, that remote users chose what they wanted to use. They had that choice and flexibility. When they come back into the office, a lot of these meeting rooms are built out for Teams only or for Zoom only. How are you accommodating user preference in meeting rooms? How are you looking at BYOD or even down the road interop?
So overall, we are a Microsoft shop. We do have a small Zoom presence for one of our business areas, but the room and the technology in the room in most of our campuses are Teams enabled and Teams for Teams use. The 1 or 2 offices that leverage Zoom heavily, we've flipped that to be Zoom enabled rooms. But our goal would be to use the technology with both options, or add Blue Jeans, or add whatever the other go-to meeting, et cetera, and so that they all work and give that user a consistent experience. So we've leaned more heavily in on the Microsoft Teams at this point in time.
So I actually have something to add there. We were in March of 2020, we were Blue Jeans predominantly. In fact, we were we were instructing people to use Blue Jeans for video meetings and not use Teams, even though we had rolled out Microsoft 365. Because it's like, well, what do I use when? What do I use in the conference room? What do I use here? What do I use there? It's the age-old question of that, right? So immediately we had about an 8-fold increase in video calls in March and April and May of 2020, but the shift was immediately to Microsoft Teams because that's where everybody was living in their collaboration space. So everybody was using Teams. And then in external meetings, a lot of people, because Zoom became a verb, right? So a lot of people were using Zoom and said, well, why can't we use Zoom? Why are we using Blue Jeans? Eventually, we switched our platform from Blue Jeans to Zoom as our second platform. We made a very recent decision to use Zoom in the conference rooms. So I know it's going to present more confusion for people. Well, why can't I just use Teams? And it's really that interoperability. We feel like in the conference room, Zoom provides the best experience in the conference room. So we're willing to sort of risk that confusion for a short period of time until people get it, so they can use Zoom more often. But interoperability, I mean, I think my first InfoComm was only about 7 years ago. I remember that was the big word at InfoComm in 2014 or whatever it was, and still doesn't exist, really, does it?
10, 12 years earlier than that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's been there for a long time.
Yeah.
I think standardization of the tool suite is really critical because through mergers and acquisitions, we are always acquiring businesses and they'll come in with their own thing. And we really try to standardize. And it is hard sometimes to rip that Band-Aid off and say, no, we're a Microsoft shop. You can't be using this technology. We want you to be able to communicate across the abroad with everyone, right? So this is it. I think that in the end, that little bit of pain in that transition is better than disrupting the whole magnitude of the rest of the enterprise.
Hi, I'm Erwin Lazar with Metrigy. Thank you so much for being here and for candidly sharing your thoughts. I'm curious if you're making any investments in supporting ideation for distributed teams. So use of virtual whiteboard applications, putting touchscreens into meeting spaces that would allow people that are in the meeting room to see what's going on for all the people that are sitting remotely, annotating a whiteboard or something along those lines. If you've thought about, do you need to go beyond just putting video and audio into meeting spaces?
So we definitely have thought about it. And we are leveraging, certainly Microsoft whiteboarding capabilities. And we do have some other agile tools that sit on top of our Rally space, Mira, and a couple others. But we are not putting physical whiteboards in Open Collab or in spaces at this point in time. It kind of goes on and off of our roadmap, but because we have such a low number of employees who are physically in an office, we're looking at potential different types of devices and touchscreen devices and things like that for that persona, if it makes sense. But we're not purchasing any ideation technologies for physical whiteboards at this time.
Well, we're opposite. We're taking the risk and making a bet that it's what we've heard that people want it. So we're in small conference rooms, we're looking to do Poly X30, X50 with Zoom in the room and a D10 companion whiteboard. Now, I don't think an Enterprise Connect that wasn't quite there yet. It was in beta, so we hope that when we're going to be able to build our own little experience center at a different office with that setup, hopefully this summer, to test use case that. We're also in spaces like this, we are going to have likely a D10 or something like that. Am I allowed to say D10 in a Poly meeting? But we're speaking frankly. So so we'll have a board, an all-in-one D10 or need or something like that. That can be used for all of the above. But the companion piece, we think we actually have in our Plainsboro office, we just recently purchased a D10, but it's not, that's when we found out it didn't work with the X30 because it's in development now. Well, you know that. I mean, so we're hoping to get that room up and running, pretty quickly to test that theory on having the companion piece for whiteboarding and ideation. Make that available.
We have one more question in the house. Okay.
Sean Spradling with Wayne House. I'm going to cheat and ask two questions. One, I'm wondering what your license counts for these various services are doing as you transition back into the office. We kind of suspected for a while that there was a rationalization of licenses. Some people just don't actually need one for the meeting service as you come back in. And the second one is I'm sensing a more agile approach to the physical plant of the office than I've seen out of IT organizations in the past. Can you speak to what that's doing to you from a budgetary perspective, how you're changing your internal processes for evaluation and purchase?
So yeah, on your first one, we're small. We have 500 licenses, so it's a rounding error for Jocelyn. So we have licenses for both, and it doesn't impact one way or the other. If we go to 600 or 800 or 400, it is what it is, right? So we have multiple platforms, and we're fine just paying the X per user per month or whatever the case may be. And I lost your second question. It was
approach to the office.
Yeah, so that's an interesting one, and I just mentioned it sort of in my last answer, right? I mean, we're hoping to I think with like we were talking about this earlier, the cost of the conference room table is now more than the cost of the technology, right? I mean, so I think you can do things now that you couldn't do years ago, because when we were integrating rooms, a room like that over there was a $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 room. Now you can get an X30 in or an X50 and decide like, well, yeah, let's put a companion whiteboard in and see if it works. And it's a thousands of dollars, not hundreds of thousands of dollars anymore. So we're taking the opportunity, and now that we have a little bit of time before our next 20,000 square foot office opens, that we are going to create our own little mini experience center to have people come in later this summer and the fall and say, hey, are we getting this right? Is this stuff good? Because we're going to be putting it in for, well, it would have been 5 or more years, but now we can even do that in less period of time too.
And we've already rationalized any duplicate licensing. So every one of our end users is licensed, and they'll keep that licensed. We do have around 20,000 employees and another 5,000 or 6,000 vendor partners that we license, and they're not physically going into a space that requires, and then we have all of our Microsoft Teams conference room licenses. So those rooms are all licensed. And like I said, on that very small one niche area where we have Zoom population. So we've already done that and harvested what we could. But I think in terms of the agile workspace, and we do have a very tight partnership with real estate. And right now we are not making any decisions on the future until we've had several months worth of data to look at, badge in data, where are people sitting, what rooms are they booking, what's important to employees. Like I talked about the sentiment surveys and things like that before we make any additional decisions. But prior to the pandemic, we did have a large percentage of offshore workers that support our IT agile teams, developers, et cetera, lots of developer roles. And that has not shifted, right? We still have that population. So we also have people all over the country, all over the world. So chances are that you're going to have a co-located team, 100%, everybody there. It's not happening, right? Like there's always going to be at least somebody who's remote. Even now, I have a team down in Florida right now running an event for one of our sales conferences. And at the last minute, they made it hybrid because people were testing positive for COVID, and they want them to be able to still participate in the fun. So I think that, we're personally waiting and have met with the head of real estate last week to reiterate that decision. And so we'll start to look at like what's next. in probably the July, August timeframe for what do we want to have that type of agile, open collab space. We do have areas on our campuses that have that already, but it's really hard to gauge usage when there's so few people coming in.
So David, I want to give you the last word before we wrap this up today. We heard a lot of things from our end user customers. Gary, Jocelyn, thank you very much. Really appreciate the comments. We've heard that a lot of our products are being used in conference rooms because they're less expensive and easier to use. We've heard that a lot of our competitors' products don't work as promised, so that's a good thing to know about. And we've mostly heard that people are reluctant to come back to offices. So I assume the conclusion that we're all making based on this is that the offices that existed pre-pandemic are not the offices that we need now. Okay. We need to change and do it, and the hybrid has to be something we support. So give us a little bit of your vision as to how we're going to support this new office, this new way of working, the new way we get together, and Polly's vision in putting it together.
Yeah, so and I'll kind of dovetail off what you said, where I think a lot of people are waiting to see how these spaces are being used.
You can get the part about our competitors' products.
I did. I got that part. Yes. Thank you. But I think that we need to wait. We need to see a little bit how they're being used. But I think more importantly, there is this recognition. It is going to be hybrid. There's no way around that. The spaces are not going to be used physically in just one way. Right? Whether that's reconfigurable, whether it's that the room needs to be built out in such a way that it can serve as a conference room and a stand-up space for that kind of an effort, and as a collaboration space, right? We saw, well, I shouldn't say we, accountants saw that we can get away with a lot less real estate. And once you let somebody who has, signature authority see that, they're going to take advantage of that, right? So the spaces are going to have to be utilized in a much more economical way, in a way where they're really able to see the return on investment from that. And just having people sitting around or coming in for a meeting that really they're all just listening to the far side, I don't think that's going to fly. So, we are really focused on enabling that experience, whatever it might be, for that physical space, and making sure that the folks who are remote, which are going to be the majority, are equally able to participate in that, whether that's a meeting, collaborative ideation, what it might be. So, and we'll hear more, I think, from Bo later today about.
And if organizations are not making that pivot, if they're expecting people to come back to the office and use the conference rooms just the way they were, I think what we're hearing is people are just not going to come in unless we make it attractive for them, or they're going to look for other employment.
Yeah, and I think the survey kind of bear that out, right? We've seen the Great Resignation. The survey is sort of showing you got to be careful. You got to be in tune with what your employees want if you're going to kind of avoid that pitfall.
David, Gary, Jocelyn, thank you very much. Can we get a round of applause for that?